Today, I'm thrilled to have Cynthia Delgado here as my podcast guest for Real Nurse Stories. Cynthia has been a nurse for 33 years and she's currently working as a nurse manager in the field of research and education. Cynthia has recently completed a PhD exploring the relationship of resilience to emotional labour in the context of mental health nursing. Cynthia, welcome to Real Nurse Stories.
Thank you, Eva, for that introduction. Very happy to be here.
I'm so excited to have the opportunity today to listen to your story because I think this is just going to be a fabulous episode. I just know that.
That's very kind. I should say thank you
So,
very much for inviting me in the first
oh, no,
place.
you're very welcome. You're very welcome. I know you're a very busy lady, so I'm very grateful that you made the time today so that we can share your story. So, Cynthia, what I'd really love to do, and I always do this with everybody who I interview, is start right at the very beginning of your career. And the first question that I'd like to ask you is, what made you want to become a nurse in the first place?
Thanks, Eva. That's always a really tricky question for me to answer. I think I don't think I knew whether I wanted to become a nurse. I kind of fell into it. I didn't think I would want to be a nurse. And my family and friends encouraged me to apply for nursing when I finished high school. And with the caveat of perhaps maybe you'll see where you land, and maybe you can swap to something
Uh-huh.
else if you like. I think actually I don't even know if I've shared this too broadly, but because I also had options to do other things, like completely separate things like computing science,
Oh,
but
gosh.
circumstances at the time
Yeah.
it dictated that I needed to stay close by to home and close by to my
Mm.
family. And I did nursing, and I started, I suppose, experiencing, I guess, what it was like to be really a crucial, what I come now to believe, or I now but really deeply believe that, a very crucial part of somebody's recovery, and being a positive influence where you can in somebody else's life.
Yes.
And so I by the time I finished nursing, I think I was still a little unsure, and I thought to myself, well, I may do a little bit of nursing for a
Mm.
while and see what happens. And I actually fell in love with it, or became very passionate about it. So some of my early experiences, I think I might have shared this previously with you in particular, but
Mm.
some of the things that really I noticed whilst I was training to be a nurse was the fact that people would, if you develop trust with them, or if you were available to them even for just a few moments or a few minutes, where they would get to share their experiences, where they would get to share a little bit about their family, or talk about anything other than just the blood pressures and the temperatures and
Yeah.
the medications and any procedures that they had to do. It was just really touching the human to human. So that human to human connection, I think,
Mm.
is what probably cemented the idea and the experience for me that you can truly make a difference for somebody just by being available to them, just for
Yeah.
that little moment in time. It doesn't have to take long. And obviously, I say that carefully and with a lot of acknowledgement around the
Mm.
fact that these days, for a lot of us in nursing who work, we find it increasingly difficult to sort of build in those moments of connectedness with other people, because it's
Mm.
so busy, and so, I guess, other things, services now, from my perspective, they pull at you, and you've got so
Yeah.
many other priorities that you feel like you have to meet. So you're continuously under pressure, and that requires a lot of you. But that was my early career. So that was my early sort of experiences. And then I chose to go into mental health nursing. I'm sure, much to a lot of people's surprises, and
Mm.
also I think, um, against a lot of people's advice. No, the advice was you lose your nurse's skills. This is what they often say. And I did a little tiny bit of general, but I was really very fresh, very green. And now I would say to anybody who's listening out there, I would say you don't lose skills, you gain them. And
Yeah.
doesn't matter which, discipline of nursing you go into, you'll gain and specialize in those skills. And so it was for me that I went into mental health nursing. And part of that experience was me really realizing at the time, and as you've already said, we're talking about 30 years ago, so it's changed a little.
Mm,
And in those days, it was very much about me, my justice bone being picked around people who had mental ill health
mm,
and significant mental illnesses, didn't really have a voice.
mhm.
And so it became almost a goal, maybe, but it's beyond a goal. I think it became a passion of mine to make sure that everybody would get a voice, especially, and me learning that mental illness didn't take away the human behind that
Yes.
illness. And so in that, I guess I became their advocate in some ways, but more so than that, I wanted to learn, and I started trying to learn how to connect with people and how to actually work with them so they could have their own voice rather than
Yeah.
me taking over theirs, if that makes sense.
It's so interesting, isn't it? Because I think that whole notion when you qualify, there's a lot of expectations on you, or there were, perhaps more so back then, about what people thought you should be doing. Or maybe it's still there, I think. But when you choose to go a route that doesn't follow, I think some of the people I talk to about their careers, it's generally what I hear is, ICU or ED. Those are the environments that people think about. But when you choose to take a different path, so mental health was for you, and for me, it was working with older people. And I too had people say, why on earth do you want to go and do that? Why don't you want to be a proper nurse? And I was like, it's it's still nursing.
Yes, it is.
Why do we demarcate that, one route is kind of not viewed as proper nursing and this route is. And I think likewise, the passion to kind of advocate for a section of society that perhaps needs that. I think mental health is often struggles with the same, perceptions. And I find that fascinating that even now, when there's so many options available to nurses, career options, that still sits there. That's still, I think today, even so.
I I I I have experienced that just from
Yeah,
even from a teaching perspective or even as a colleague perspective, and where that actually comes up with colleagues who do not work in mental health, and
yeah,
they're still actually saying, oh, but they'll lose their skills. What skills?
yeah,
Now that
yeah,
we're in university for nursing, when we
yeah,
come out of university, we're only just starting. We've been taught
yeah,
basics on a range of areas and a range of things
yeah.
that we can take and apply anywhere we go, really. But we're not
Mm.
really specialists. We're not ED specialists. We're not ICU specialists. We're not
No.
mental health specialists by any stretch of the imagination. Just out of university, we learned those.
Yeah,
And yeah, and it takes, I think, I mean, I'm very passionate about nursing, full stop. And
yeah.
funnily enough, in my career, I went back into general, not to as a general nurse, but as a mental health nurse.
Mm.
But 15 years of that career was spent in the general hospital and emergency departments, working
Yeah,
alongside
yeah,
my other colleagues. Um, so I don't believe that you lose anything, that you
no,
actually gain a
no.
lot more. And really, I suppose at the end of the day, it's up to you how you develop that, or how you take that and how you
Mm.
converse around that with
Yes,
people.
yeah, yeah. It's almost like I think you when you're passionate about the work that you do, so for mental health, I think it gives you a platform to then be able to advocate for these things and talk about some of the things we're talking about now. and help people to see, that it's fine to want to go and work. We need people who want to go and work and support people who are struggling with mental health. And I think more so today in the modern world, because we know the numbers around people who are struggling with all aspects of mental health is growing. It's not going away. So there's a real need for those skills. And I just want to come back to for a minute to what you said at the beginning about the human to human connection, because one of the things I wanted to ask you is whether, I know that you work a lot in education and research, and whether we've kind of lost some of those components. Well, not lost them, but we don't talk about them in the same way that perhaps we did going back. And I trained in the 80s, and that human connection and that seeing the person, not the illness, there was quite a focus on that. And I wonder whether in the rush to become a profession, we maybe don't articulate those, and we focus perhaps a lot on the skills that are needed and maybe not so much on the importance of the human to human connection, appreciating that there isn't always the time to do that as well. And I think that's a delicate balance. And I'm just interested in your thoughts, Cynthia, on that.
Yes, I think about this often,
Yeah.
because I've argued for many, many years that nursing is in nature
Mm.
an interpersonal profession. And when we talk about being an interpersonal profession, we are talking about person to person, which obviously in this context means human to human.
Yeah.
And the research, not research that I've done myself in that specific context, but the research that I've read about where people thrive, where healing occurs, where recovery
Mm.
occurs at the best points, is through human to human connection. So it's a
Mm.
connectedness that people seek out. And we've heard tales, and there is research out there still that talks about, particularly in nursing,
Mm.
around how people thrive or are better or they recover quicker, and that could be even be just in the context of them accepting treatment or accepting intervention, simply because of the relationship that they've had with
Yeah.
the nurse or with another health professional, of course. So it
Yeah.
applies to all humans, but keeping it in
Yeah.
nursing, then look, I'm not sure. Because sometimes I feel, I have discussions with colleagues around this, particularly
Mm.
around education, and particularly, so part of the work that I do now is provide a bit of education at a university, but also to colleagues who are just commencing to
Mm.
work as nurses, so like fully fledged, so out of uni. And one of the things that have happened over time, and I've been able to observe, and some colleagues would agree with this. Some people might argue, and there's always advantages and disadvantages. However, what we are seeing is that communication in the context of being present and
Mm.
having the ability to remain attentive,
Yeah.
it's actually a little diminished.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And to be there for another human being, you have to be able to develop or at least grow in that attentiveness and that presence,
Mm.
like actually being able to sit or stand and
Yeah.
really, really, really listen to another
Yeah.
human being, respond rather than react emotionally.
Yes.
Such keys. And I'm wondering, who may be listening right now to this and thinking, yep, we know this, Cynthia. And yet, what I am seeing is that it's increasingly difficult
Mm.
for colleagues and actually maybe even for humanity in general. I'm not
Yeah.
sure. Big
Yeah.
call here, that it's actually increasingly difficult to connect. I mean, I'm still amused, even without even talking about nursing, although it does happen when I walk into hospitals and I go into lifts, that people are all on their phones looking down. No one looks at each other. It makes for a very awkward and uncomfortable space for
Yeah.
some,
Yeah.
especially when you get me who walks in and perhaps says hello,
Yeah.
and you see people sort of, jumping and thinking, oh my God, she spoke to us. Yes, I did.
Yeah.
Uh, and I just find that fascinating. and also find it scary in a little way, because in the past, and I've always rebelled a little bit against this description. Co-communication, soft skills, there's nothing soft
Yeah.
about it.
No, no.
Especially now, it's become, it seems, harder.
Yes. Yeah, I would agree with that because I see the same in leadership. That's my area of interest, and the same issues around listening at a deeper level and communicating in a way that's seeing the person, not being reactive, and
Absolutely.
so I think it's across everything really, and not just nursing. We're obviously talking about nursing today, but it's an interesting topic, and I think we struggle to do those things that are really important to patients that make a difference because the nature of the work is so busy and there's targets and pressures, and it's
That's
really,
right.
really challenging, I think, to try to do that, find the time
Absolutely.
to do it.
Absolutely. I think, I mean, often one of the things that I think about is that once you have experience connecting with another in a true
Yes.
sense, I
Yeah.
think it grows from there. I think once you know what that would feel like, sound like, look like, I think people can do it and don't require a lot of time to do it. And some
Mm,
people have it in spades. I've
mm.
seen nursing colleagues in all areas. I'm not
Yes.
talking about mental health here. I'm just talking about nursing in
General.
general, who have that in spades, and they easily connect with other people, and all it takes is just a few minutes here and there, and they
Yeah.
connect with
Yeah.
with the other person. And I think, as you were saying, one of the words that you used, Eva, was that, in nursing, sometimes we struggle now because of all the demands. And that's the real sense. And I guess a true word is a struggle that occurs. And I know that you've had other speakers in your podcast, that I've
Yeah.
listened to myself, that,
Yeah.
talk about where and what nurses may be experiencing, even
Mm.
to the levels of trauma. So if we go that, I won't talk about trauma today, of course, but
Yeah.
if we go thinking about all the experiences for people, we sometimes forget that as nurses, we're also people, and therefore, in an emotional sense, in a present sense, or even in terms of cognitive ability
Mm.
or cognitive overload, even, or just in
Mm.
terms of thinking, if we're overloaded, we struggle. So that was the
Yeah.
word. We struggle to, first of all, make sense of the world. I think the other important key thing here is sometimes based on how healthcare systems have developed,
Mm.
there's a lot of sense, and that's on a personal level for me, but also just hearing from other
Yeah.
colleagues, and through my clinical supervision work, or even my as an educator.
Yeah.
I think what happens is that there's a disconnect now between what perhaps even as ourselves as humans, or ourselves as professionals, even we don't even have to take the personal, but that sense of purpose, or the
Mm.
values that we have around. A lot of people go into nursing because they've got a real sense of wanting to make a difference, and they're passionate about caring for people, speaking out for people, and
Yeah.
looking out for people, caring
Yeah.
for people. So
Yeah.
there's all the altruistic values that are really, really important. And yet, when the demands from workplaces are continuing to be, well, you got to tick that box, and you got to finish that, and you got to
Yeah.
answer to this, and you got to pretty much prove your existence. And the only way that you can prove to your existence is by doing what services have
Measurable.
determined, yes,
Yes.
are the thing. That sense of purpose, and you sense your values, I
Mm.
start to be disconnected. And so it creates, I would say, almost like a veil and a cloud
Yeah.
that prevents you from looking or focusing or continuing to focus on what's really, really important,
Mm.
or what really will achieve the outcomes that we really,
Mm.
really want. And ultimately, I think everybody's, whether they realize it or not, I think in being a nurse, innately, the outcome that you'd like to see is for people to get better, or for
Yeah.
people to,
Yeah.
to be able to be in a better space than when you first met them.
Yeah.
whatever
Yeah.
that means, whether
Yeah.
physical, mental, cognitive, emotional, all of those sort of things.
Mm.
Yeah, so I think, I feel a little sad to a degree, although in my own experience, even as, as I told you about the student, and as a student and being able to speak to people,
Yeah.
part of the reason, ironically enough, for me being able to do that is because I probably was not necessarily the first, but pretty close to one of the first groups that did not train at the hospital like they used to. It
Yeah.
was college, and so students were not wanted.
Yes.
Nursing students, not everybody. Like I
No.
met, so I talked about that, but I also talk about the absolutely wonderful human beings, and I'll say it like that, who
Yes.
were
Yeah.
super nurses, who just took us all under their wing and
Yeah.
really, really made sure that we felt welcomed and that we were
Yeah.
learning and that we were able to feel safe enough to ask
Yeah.
questions, and gave us the opportunity to actually practice what we were learning. So
Yeah.
I will be forever grateful. I don't remember all of their names now, but I will
Yeah.
forever be
Yeah.
grateful to those nurses who made it worthwhile and made me think that this was actually something that could be achievable despite the other side of things,
Yeah.
which was
Yeah.
saying, we don't want you.
Yeah.
Pretty
Yeah.
much, what would you know? You don't know what's going on because you've gone and done this, thing to go to college or universities now. And
Yeah.
yet that because of that, I was able to actually connect with people
Yeah. Yeah.
and
I,
and walk out of the shift, walk out of, my
yeah.
learning, feeling like, wow, I could actually make a difference being a
Yeah.
nurse, which is, I think, ultimately what kept me there.
Yeah. And you articulate that so beautifully, Cynthia, because, just having the right people in your corner who support you and show you the way to be is
Absolutely.
such an important foundation when you're starting either in your training or as you finish your training. And I think sadly we have, like you referenced there, so many nurses who come into nursing for those altruistic reasons. And we have this real disconnect. So by the time they get to the end of the training, it's like the reality is very different from those altruistic values. And I think to be
Mhm.
able to find your people in a
Mm.
world that is, in a health world that's full of, pressure and all of the things that we know about. I don't want to get too bogged down into those today, but I think it's so challenging. One of the things I talk a lot about is how you find professionally generous people. How do you
Yeah.
recognize them? Because those are the people that will help you. But then equally, I'm always conscious when I talk about that those people are probably likely to be overloaded because of the fact that they're the people who want to help and train and support and nurture. And wouldn't it be lovely, in an ideal world, if we could grow that out more so that there was less reliance on those
Absolutely.
few people who must sometimes go home and think, I need to lie down.
Well, there is a cost of energy, I suppose. I think,
Yeah,
because of the good experiences that I had, and because I suppose when my career took me, I spoke a
yeah,
little bit, or I mentioned before, about going back and working in the general hospital emergency
yes,
departments alongside, emergency nurses, alongside, any other type of nurse, because in
yeah,
being so my role was in consultation liaison, and so I was able to. That was part of my job, going to all the different units and wards and specialties that needed some mental health
yeah,
input, I will say, because it wasn't always advice. It was just working alongside people, and I think that cemented that need and desire for me. I think professionally as well, I began to understand how it crucially more important than what I had experienced myself. So how crucial it is to have somebody in your corner, as you
yeah,
said, Eva. And and also realizing sadly that as nurses, a group of nurses, sometimes we don't feel that that's there. And I'm
Yes.
not talking
Yeah.
about nursing in particular, as in this, you're always going to find a nurse, a colleague who's going
Yeah.
to be there, but actually in the big beast that the healthcare systems
Yeah.
are, sometimes we feel lost in that system.
Yeah.
And I suppose part of my role in those roles, part of what I did was work alongside my nursing colleagues and work together and
Yeah.
to try and see how we might better outcomes for everybody. So not just for
Yeah.
patients and their families, but also for my colleagues. It became almost well, it did become a very, a big passion of mine to sort of start thinking about, well, how do we support and
Yes.
how do we grow the carers, as in
Yeah.
the healthcare, providers
Yeah.
who need to be, in order for them to have enough for themselves, enough in their bucket or enough in,
Yes.
in
Yeah.
themselves to be able to provide for others. Because if you take all that away, plus the disconnect between values and things, I think that really that can negatively impact then
Yeah.
not just us but what we do, and it becomes a chore. It's no longer a craft,
Yes.
it's no longer
Yeah.
a desire to help, it's just because we have to.
Yeah.
And as we're living right now in the 21st century, that's become a crucial aspect of this, that people go to work now to survive themselves.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think it is harder
I
to
think
be
so.
available for others.
Yeah. Cynthia, I really want to give you an opportunity now to talk about kind of where you're at currently in your career, because I know that you've done some fabulous work on resilience and particularly the emotional labour in mental health nursing. And I'd really like to invite you just to share, your passion for the work that you do comes across loud and clear. And I know
Thank
we've
you.
we've chatted before, but it's such a heart-centered passion when you talk. I feel that very much, but I think I'd like to give you this opportunity just to share the work and the study that you've done and what you found from that, because I think there's some really important messages in this work. So I'd like to hand that to you now and just give you that opportunity to share that.
Thank you, Eva. That's very kind. Well, out of that work that I was just mentioning,
Yeah.
particularly in working with colleagues, there's a lot of work that goes in particularly around research and things in terms of what works, interventions, and what's best for patients and families. I think probably not enough in a lot of
Yes.
actually, in
Yeah.
fairness, probably not enough, but a lot more than what goes into the professionals themselves, and that includes nurses. And I think a lot of my work was supporting my colleagues sometimes in really, really difficult and tough situations,
Mm.
in caring um, and working with patients. The other aspect of it, that sometimes the difficulties was around discordance between teams and colleagues and different disciplines.
Mhm.
And of course, the people that were really, that I guess I was speaking with, my nursing colleagues, were really down and out, because sometimes they wanted to really advocate for the patient or the family member or certain things. And they were being, I guess, they felt shut down in different
Yeah.
ways by different people, different colleagues, different disciplines, power struggles as well,
Yes. Yeah.
hierarchies. And I thought to myself, wow, um, what is it? What is this? What do we have to do? Because a lot of the time, and I'll be frank here, no judgment on this, but often I
Mm.
would come in into those places or situations, and I will be met with a lot of hostility.
Yes.
My title about being mental health nurse sometimes comes with that,
Yes.
with
Yeah.
that, I don't know what to call it, with that. It's not a shield, but I guess it
Yeah.
initially. engenders a little bit of
Yeah.
hostility. First of all, because what would I know? You don't
Yeah.
work with us, you're not here, you come in, and
Yeah.
we're all, of course, very, very right around me only being a visitor in the space. But
Yeah.
as we got to know each other and develop relationships, and this is one of the key things, develop really good
Mm.
relationships, and realizing that we could work together and thinking about what we could do, it actually worked. But one of the things that I noticed was and I will call it out as it is labeled, if you like, but
Mm.
there was a lot of dysregulation. So a lot of
Yeah.
emotional dysregulation from my colleagues, a lot of reactivity, a lot of anger,
Yeah.
a lot of negative emotions being expressed for different things, not necessarily always at me, because
Yeah.
obviously I wasn't necessarily the cause of what was going on for them, the frustrations. Nevertheless, this is what was being experienced.
Mm.
And at the end of the day, I don't think there's never any intention of that really being passed on to patients or
No.
colleagues or
No.
families. Inevitably, though, if you're in that state, you're not at your
Yeah.
best and you're
No.
not really able to see things or hear people or being able to
Mm.
attribute. So I suppose this is where it all started. Eva, you asked me about the
Yeah.
research that I did. I started thinking, well, at the time I was also working half-time at the university. And of course, there's always the little nudge of, are you going to do your own research, Cynthia? So I think I started looking initially at emotional intelligence
Mm.
because of the aspect of needing to self-regulate and what that
Mm.
meant, and thinking about whether regulation was protective, not protective, whether it was necessarily, how do we do it in order, I guess what we spoke at the very beginning or mentioned at the
Yeah.
very beginning, how do we self-regulate and be present for people? Because if you're not regulating, if you're not actually aware, self-aware of your own
Yeah.
state and your own
Yeah.
emotions, you're really not aware of how this may or may not impact another human
No.
being,
No.
and what happens to this, ephemeris connection that we've
Yeah.
been speaking about. So I started investigating a little bit of that, and then I came across somebody. Oh, I would say the now dirty word resilience. Somebody mentioned that perhaps what I was looking at was resilience, and
Yeah.
for everybody who's listening out there, it hasn't escaped me, and I have been confronted by that,
Yeah.
through people talking about this resilience word and how and what it has now, what it signifies for a lot of people now, which
Mm.
is that they think that it's, they're expecting people to be resilient, and it puts it back on the individual,
Yeah.
and it's
Yeah.
individual's fault. And when it comes to nurses or healthcare workers, actually, it's the health workers' sole responsibility to be
Yeah.
resilient. So just to clear the air, that is not what I studied. And
No.
I agree that that those sentiments, I agree with the sentiments.
Yeah.
What I would say though is that we just need to be mindful of what words represent for everybody. And resilience, for me, as I have come to understand it, it's really a process.
Mm.
And this process we choose or choose not to engage with or work towards or have a look at, and that the outcome in actual fact is our well-being.
Yes.
Or
Yeah.
not,
Yeah.
as it may be. So that is the context that I'd like to put out there first and foremost. And so in discussion with colleagues, mentors, and different people at the time, somebody did mention the word, I think you might be looking at resilience, Cynthia, not necessarily emotional intelligence. And of course, now I fully agree and understand that
Mm.
emotional intelligence, another big concept, of course,
Mm.
is part of this resilience process. And that, yes, that's the emotional intelligence. It's really, yes, I will give them that. It is about the individual in that
Yeah.
case.
Yeah.
But in the context of resilience, and resilience at work, because I looked very carefully at the work context, the professional
Mm.
context, and nurses. So when I was working in consultation liaison, this work was really about looking at all of nursing. And so I went and did, like most of us do, a literature review around resilience and emotional labor. So I probably should explain that a little bit before I go
Mm.
on. So one of the things, so you've got emotional intelligence on one side, which is about the self-awareness, awareness of emotions in others, and also, how we
Oh.
use our emotions. and how we identify them and how we work with them. But emotional labor is ever present in our work. So in the context of emotional labor in nursing, it is really about what we do with our emotional state. Obviously, I'm not being very eloquent here.
No, you
The
are.
actual definitions around emotional labor is around that self-management and or self-regulation of emotions in the self in order that we are then able to display or behave in a way that makes other people feel cared for. So obviously I take no uh, kudos for the word that was actually coined by Arlie Hochschild, who studied or explored, sorry, the experiences of air hostesses and how they and what they would have to do from an emotional perspective in the context
Yeah.
of paid work. They get
Yes.
paid to be responsive. They get paid to attend to people and respond to people, even when and if the people are being rude and not listening. So really difficult sort of interpersonal situations.
Yes. Yeah.
So when I started looking at this, at the resilience bit, it was I did agree, or in terms of my own experience in nursing, that it was often in the interpersonal context. And then I went and read about emotional labor in nursing. Uh, and the book that I read was The Unmanaged Heart of Healthcare. So, so in nursing, the emotional labor of nursing, Catherine Theodosius was the nurse scholar who picked up Ali Hosha's work
Yes.
and I guess applied it to nursing. And in her work, she spoke about three different types of emotional labor: the interpersonal type, so therapeutic emotional labor. Then you had collegial emotional labor, which is really important, which is really about our interpersonal relationships with colleagues. She also spoke about instrumental emotional labor, though, which is really, that piqued my interest as well, that we also feel sometimes in the context of us doing things. For example, when you give a vaccination, an injection to somebody, particularly with kids, or we use instruments that may cause another
Yeah.
person pain, or that we might not necessarily agree with. And here I'll give a shout out to maybe my mental health nursing colleagues who are often required, well, hopefully not often, but sometimes they're required to physically restrain another human being.
Yes. Yeah.
That's not
Yeah.
something that they actually want to do.
No.
And it's a very uncomfortable,
Yeah.
emotionally painful, some people will argue morally painful
Yeah.
experience. And so Catherine Theodosius in her instrumental emotional labor talked about what we do in those instances. So for example, in Hochschild's definition of emotional labor, she talks about deep acting and surface acting, and that in surface acting we suppress maybe the real emotions that we may be feeling, and I guess almost we generate a demeanor that will
Yeah.
be more conducive to whatever we needed, but we're still left inside with whatever it is. So for
Yeah.
example, if we're, for example, nurses who dislike giving injections, dislike injections, or we're scared of injections, we're going to be carrying that fear inside, and that perhaps even disgust or that discomfort when we have to give that to another human being because we don't agree with it, and yet we have to do it for professional practice. Now,
Yes.
no nurse is going to have the true facial expression that they want to portray, that I
Yeah.
know obviously people that are listening can't see, but that face that we put, that we crunch up the face, we furrow our brow, and we go,
Yeah.
oh
Yeah.
no, I don't want to do this. We actually hide it all.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we try and portray a demeanor of calmness because that's what we hopefully want the person to be in order for us to give that
Yeah.
injection,
Yeah.
for example, as an example. And then you've got the other aspect, which is a deep acting, which is when we actually genuinely can engender emotions or feelings that align, I guess, with whatever the situation in front of us is. So, for example, I think for people that love babies and maybe midwives, if they love
Yeah.
babies, the minute that, a baby is born, they will have those feelings of joy that
Yeah.
hopefully the parents do, the
Yeah.
mother, the
Yeah.
father, or, or
Yeah.
the family unit that they have. So they you're not it's not pretending,
Not suppressing.
you're not
No.
suppressing, which means
No.
there's no emotional dissonance.
Yeah.
Now, in my studies, I discovered that. So in looking at all of these, first of all, my first realization was, gosh, emotional labor is well and truly present in just about everything that we do in
Yeah.
nursing.
Yeah. Very much so.
Absolutely. And do we surface that? A lot. Well, that's of course emotional dissonance, which
Mm.
means, that our internal, I guess,
Yeah.
experience is not
Yeah.
matching the external that we're trying to
Yeah.
portray. And that has been studied already. And of course, and unfortunately, that what happens if we don't do something to attend to that, if we don't pull on some internal, external resources, if we don't care for
Mm.
ourselves emotionally, mentally around that sort of thing, that can lead to different things, burnout,
Burnout. Yeah.
physical ill health, mental ill health, increased stress. So lots of different things because we're not living our truth, I suppose. We're not being
No.
genuine in those moments. And if there's too many of those. So I started thinking about this in the context of, what we did as nurses and my colleagues, and thinking, well, how do we help out? What do we need to do? And hence that started the
Yeah.
long-winded way to tell you. That's how the study started,
Yeah.
looking at that and thinking, well, what do we do? And so in the literature review, I found out, surprisingly enough, that there were other scholars in nursing who had already looked at different fields, or nurses in different fields, I should say, like ICU,
Yeah.
actually aged
Yeah.
care as well, burns nurses, I think, that had done studies around resilience,
Yeah.
and,
Yeah.
and at that time, but not on emotional labor. So just resilience based on their work,
Yeah.
even though in some of the writings and some of the contexts that we're writing about, you could probably say, oh yeah, that falls under emotional experiences, emotional labor, but they actually didn't look at that as a
Uh-huh.
concept or as a thing. So that was the first thing. So I go, okay, they're not looking at emotional labor and resilience together yet. What I was really surprised about, though, was there was very, very little with mental health nurses.
Yeah.
And
Surprising.
very surprising, considering that
Yeah.
their actual work is, I wouldn't like to give percentages, but it's the majority of the work is interpersonal. The work
Yes. Yeah.
occurs within that relationship. And I thought, wow, there's, something's going on here. And at the time, even though I wasn't working in the mental health field per se, or in the inpatient or community services, I was providing clinical supervision to a number of mental health nurses at the time. And obviously, without just generally speaking, what they were bringing into supervision would have been in the context of this dissonance and the emotional labor that they were experiencing a lot of the time
Yeah.
in their work, whether it was with patients, families, and or colleagues. And then some. So the sum was about I guess the system.
Yes. Yeah.
And I'm always very careful when I say systems, because in my world, systems are people.
Yeah.
Systems are
Yeah.
things, but people are
Yeah.
making decisions about things,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
people are enforcing things. So it just being very mindful that there's processes in play that
Yeah.
we often just accept. And so, but they were also feeling that dissonance, that they were expected to come to work, put on a brave face, a happy face, depending on what was called for, or
Uh-huh.
you know, or something that said that you were okay at work, and you need to leave all your stuff behind. So it's almost like asking people to leave their humanity behind. Impossible, right? Uh,
Yeah.
but this is, I guess, a sense. And so I started looking into resilience. And so one of the things I found out was about that at the mental health nursing group. And so I started looking at mental health nurses, and, very grateful to the hundreds of, mental health nurses who took part in this nationally in
Yeah.
Australia, for me to be able to look at this. And then, so it was a mixed methods study. So I did a quantitative phase first. So the surveys that measured people's workplace resilience, that
Yeah.
measured
Yeah.
their emotional labor, and also the outcomes that I spoke about before, measured their psychological well-being and mental distress. And the mental distress scale that I use, because there's a few, but I
Yeah.
looked at the
Yeah.
DAS, which is depression, anxiety, stress. So all those things were looked at. And I guess what was found was that people who scored higher in that workplace resilience um, had what we would hopefully expect, lower emotional labor
Yes.
scores,
Yeah.
particularly the surface acting scores.
Yeah.
And and higher resilience also meant higher psychological well-being
Yeah.
and lower mental distress, which is fair because that's absolutely what you'd like.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the second phase was a qualitative phase, in terms of the study. What was what we ended up picking as I guess the interest, the phenomena of interest, if you like, for those of you who do research out there, is that there were a bunch of nurses who had higher resilience, but also paradoxically higher emotional labor than the rest.
Yeah.
So we wanted to know what
Why?
they were doing.
Yeah.
How he said that how he said that their well-being,
Yeah.
remains
Yeah.
higher. How he said that the emotional labor is, it's still high, but they're
Yeah.
doing okay.
Yeah.
To a degree, obviously, it's ups
Yeah.
and downs. And I think the other thing to say about any of this, that of course, anything to do with anything around emotional states or experiences, human experiences, is that it is very, very dynamic. It's not linear,
No.
meaning that it can
No.
change. In the context of what we did, of course, cross-sectional study, in those moments that they answered, this is what they had. And so we invited, some nursing colleagues to be interviewed. And, I had the absolute privilege, and I learned, you always learn something. And I think I
Yeah.
learned so much
Always.
from them, who gave their time for me to be able to listen to their stories around resilience and emotional labor.
Yeah.
And
Can I ask
ah,
you,
yes, of
sorry,
course.
there's a question as you're
Yes, of course.
talking, and I'm just thinking, do you think that some of this is also connected to generational differences? Because if I think back to my training, and I can distinctly remember in my training being told off for
Yeah.
basically not getting emotionally connected to patients or showing emotions. And
Mm,
I was somebody back then, I still am really, my heart's on my sleeve. And I can remember being really kind of bemused by that statement, thinking, well, aren't we here to care for people? This was right at the beginning of my training. I still remember it. But I wonder whether, I think when you look at the modern workplace and workforce now, we have different generations. So we have people who are my generation who maybe did kind of enter the career being taught that because it was something you were
mm,
taught. And then we have the younger generations who I think that has changed in the way that
mm, mm,
we
mm,
teach. And I
mm,
I just I don't know. I think sometimes, well, there's a few things, but I think we don't always appreciate the different mix, and there's positives to that. I'm not saying it's a negative at all, but it helps us to understand why
mm,
there may be those differences in the
mm.
workplace. So I'm just curious to know whether that came up anywhere or not.
Well, look, we did look at age.
Yeah.
But in the mix, they were all ages. And
Yeah.
11, I ended up interviewing 11 colleagues, and there were a range of ages.
Yeah.
So I had a
Yeah.
couple in their 20s. I had a couple and by that I mean that the couple in their 20s, one of them I think was only maybe 2 years into their practice.
Mm.
And then I had on the other extreme somebody who was about to retire.
Yes.
He
Yeah.
was in their late
Yeah.
60s and
Yeah.
finally about to retire. And, and so the benefit of their experience and but everybody had the thing. And funnily enough, when we did the testing, age had very little impact on
Okay.
resilience.
Yeah. Well, that's
A,
interesting.
yeah, I know. I mean, you can't always predict because I think
No.
I think perhaps it's more to do with life experiences.
Yeah. Yeah. Which, yeah, I think, and that was my other thought as you were talking,
Mm,
we're sometimes very siloed, aren't we? Professional research.
absolutely.
And, as you were talking, I was thinking there's so much we can learn by going out and considering, like you referenced there, the work that was done understanding air hostess and their roles and how they do it. We're not always great at looking broader and seeing how other industries have done it and taking that and
Mm,
applying, the learnings
yes.
from the research. I find that fascinating.
And that's a key, I think, is the learnings from,
Mm.
because I fear that sometimes we have done it that way where we've
Mm.
applied business models to healthcare
Yeah, yeah.
and at the risk of sounding extremist. I don't necessarily, I don't know that that's been a good thing
Mm.
always
Yeah,
because and I think what we're not very good at overall is looking at the human behind anything.
yeah,
We've lost the art of humanity. I mean, that's a very heavy thing to say, but I wonder, as human beings, we come with thinking,
mm,
obviously we come with thoughts, we
mm,
come with emotions and feelings, perspectives and behavior.
yes, yeah,
And whilst just about all of our eh, teachings, professional stances or standards or whatever you
mm,
look at policies and even
mm,
the hint at what's expected of you around particular behavior. And in actual fact, without saying it, they demand that you emotionally manage at work.
yeah, yeah,
And some of it is absolutely understandable. Obviously, I think one of the things that you said, about emotions and age and how people learn, one of the things that came out of the study in the end was that boundaries, which is that's another subject in
yeah.
itself that we can talk about another time. But boundaries are
Yeah,
intrapersonal, so the ones that
yeah,
you sort of do for yourself, the interpersonal ones, how you act and respond and what you
mm,
say in the context of an interpersonal interaction or a relationship, and then the boundaries between home life and work life or boundaries
yeah,
between that and the
yeah,
other
yeah,
are really, really important. And they're a form of self-care. And
yes,
that's what came out
absolutely.
of the qualitative studies as well. That was a common thing amongst these 11 nurses. The boundaries were pretty intact.
Mm,
They learned to say no mindfully, things
yes,
like that. But just going back around what we were saying with, when you learn and the emotions that we display, I think as long as we're displaying the emotion safely
yeah,
somewhere
yeah,
and it doesn't overshadow the experience of the other,
yeah, yes,
we're allowed
yeah,
to have it.
yeah, yes. And
Does that does that make sense? I
it,
think
it does. And I think it's an important conversation to have.
absolutely, because I think, and that's what we talk when we talk about external resources.
Mm,
If you felt really, really distraught yourself as a nurse in doing something or saying something or having to attend to something that you felt uncomfortable about,
mm,
where do you then take it? Because you'll be swallowing all of that. You'll be keeping
yeah.
quiet in that whilst you're doing it, maybe
And
in order to
that's,
preserve your professionality,
yeah.
right?
And that really leads us nicely into the role of clinical supervision, isn't it? Which, in many ways, I think I can remember being quite shocked that clinical supervision kind of, I used to talk about it. People say, what's clinical supervision? I'm not making fun of people who said that in any way, shape, or form. It was just for me really surprising, having most of my career was worked in the UK, where there was clinical supervision in the NHS, and you were actively encouraged to participate or become a supervisor. There was formal training with that role. And my experience here in Australia was it wasn't there. People didn't know about it. And I can remember really thinking I was quite shocked by that. And yet I'll let you talk about that, Cynthia, as this is part of your research, but I think it's a really important component. It's
Uh,
not the answer to everything, but it's a
no,
great place to start.
that's right. No, and thank you. I mean, what we found in the research in both the quantitative and the qualitative
Mm,
side of things was that clinical supervision positively impacted levels of resilience if we
mm.
look at the quant.
Yeah.
And the colleagues the majority of the colleagues, I think 10 out of the 11 were in supervision
Mm.
and spoke very highly of supervision, clinical supervision. And that's
Yeah.
reflective clinical supervision, just in case that there's sort of
Yes.
questions
Yeah.
around that. And it is a place that so if we talk about supervision in that context, clinical supervision for nurses is having a dedicated time and space, safe space with
Mm.
somebody who can guide a reflective process around the experiences that you have at work. It could be anything. It includes the experiences that we have in terms of interpersonal connections or disconnections or
Yeah.
interactions that we've had, difficulties in dealing with certain things. And so when I was saying before about, that we suppress or we carry it, we still carry it inside, but we're not able to air it out in the
Yeah.
moment. We're actually then able, hopefully, to air it out elsewhere. And supervision is one of those things.
Yeah.
And I mean, supervision is not the only thing. I mean, you've got your
No.
colleagues,
Yeah.
if you've got a good team of people as well who you can speak to, that's something else. But clinical supervision in particular, because it's 1 hour a month, hopefully protected time within
Mm.
work time, where you get to unpack, you get to challenge yourself, and you get to really try and look at the situation outside of yourself and within yourself
Yeah.
and think about whether, sometimes it's about unpacking the great things that you've done, because I think a lot of people associate those sort of
Yes.
things with speaking about challenges only
Yeah. Yeah.
and bad situations or challenging situations. It's not always that. You
No.
can unpack. It is about learning. It's a learning process.
Yeah.
and and hopefully whatever learnings you gather or whatever little light bulb moments you might gain within that, in part of that reflective space, then you're able to go away and apply it.
Mhm.
uh, and my one of my thoughts often is that you can, once your eyes are opened, they can never be shut again necessarily for that little thing.
Yeah.
So it's a good discovery process, particularly because clinical supervision, if we go back to what things about resilience. So one of the things around resilience and some of the things that these nurses had in space was also the ability to self-regulate. But
Yeah.
underpinning that was that absolute self-awareness.
Yeah.
What is going on for me while I'm in front of
Yeah.
this person? I'm actually struggling here and it's not serving the purpose,
Yeah.
not having a good outcome. So I'm going to pause this interaction for now. I'm
Yeah.
going to go away, gather myself, and come back. I'm noticing that I'm actually really, really tired and I'm not good to anyone. I've realized that, I'm having very negative thinking about the service,
Mm.
very negative thinking about what I do. I'm going to actually need to take a little bit of leave.
Yeah. Yeah.
All of this, so clinical supervision was a big part of that. So, and some of them took all those conversations to the clinical supervisor and spoke about those sort of things.
Mm.
About, obviously, they didn't share all the details with me, but they,
No.
they were talking about if they struggle, that was a very helpful component with them. They also talked about the team members when they
Yeah.
were the good team members. They also spoke about, like I said, they didn't actually, I can't remember if anybody, I think one person used the word boundary a lot. The rest
Yeah.
didn't necessarily use the word, but they were referring to
To
boundaries. They
boundaries.
had very, very, very clear, I guess, self rules
Yeah.
about, well, I take my break every day, not necessarily at the same time every day.
No.
And some people were working shift work, by the way, in that group.
Yeah.
Some weren't, some were. And they were saying, no, but I do take my break because I've realized that if I don't take my break, I'm actually mentally exhausted and
Mm.
I'm not thinking straight and I'm not available and I'm not sharp enough to be able to do all the
Yeah.
things that I need to do.
Yeah.
I'm not sharp enough to make sound decisions and people are relying on me. So it was embedded with that altruistic
Mm.
sense,
Yeah.
so that the compassion for others is what spurred them on as well. So they used it. They knew
Yeah.
how to use that in order to think, okay, what do I need to do? The other key for all these nurses too was their what I suppose when you sort of think and look at everything together, all of them had a good level of growth mindset. Now, I didn't measure growth mindset, but they all were in lifelong learning. They all had that
Yeah.
flavor.
Yeah.
Supervision was a learning space. They talked about, well, I need to know what I'm doing. So they kept challenging themselves to learn a little bit more. And when they found themselves in a challenge, they would go actually and look it up and study it, or they
Yeah.
would develop a particular aspect of their craft because they thought,
Yeah.
oh, I'm using this a lot, or this is coming up a lot for me when I'm
Yeah.
interacting with patients
Yeah.
or with colleagues, particularly around conflict resolution, communication, so
Yeah.
the interpersonal capabilities. And again, that came a lot with thinking about themselves. And whilst they were in the process with other people,
Yeah.
being introspective at that moment, but still being able to maintain that presence. So that's a really, really, I suppose, high level and challenging capability to
Yeah.
maintain.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
one of the key factors here was that you need energy for that. How do you have energy? You have healthy boundaries around your
Yeah.
self-care at work and outside
Yeah.
work.
Yeah.
Trying to sort of have some sort of sense of separation between your work and your
Yeah.
personal home life.
Yeah.
And in terms of emotions, discovering what was going on for you, that it wasn't emotions.
Yeah.
As I said very much earlier on in the piece, we forget that we're human too, and sometimes things do affect us. So whilst I'm talking about this group of people having at the time, high levels of resilience and being able to adapt, because that's what resilience is at the end of the
Yes.
day,
Yeah.
your ability or your capability of adaptation, positively adapting in the face of adversity or
Yeah.
challenges. And in this
Yeah.
context, emotional labor was the adversity or the big challenge,
Yeah.
with all the workplace stresses that push and
Yes.
pull. And so, but one of the things was that self-awareness, that self-care to feed back the energy that they required in order to self-regulate
Yeah.
and therefore be able to be therapeutic, collegial, and maintain the professionalism
Yeah.
as well, which gave them a sense of pride. The other thing that they had was a sense of purpose.
Yes. Yeah.
They were very, very grounded in their altruistic
Yeah.
values of making a difference, compassion, but
Yeah.
also about why am I here?
Yeah.
And so they were very clear about that, very inspiring as well, because whilst they were very humble, I think, um and very willing and I guess generous with the time and in terms of sharing, that's some of the stuff that I picked up. I thought, wow.
Yeah.
And here it is right in front of us. Sounds simple. Unfortunately, it's not. And going back, Eva, to what I first said about resilience and people sort of, I know that I spoke to another colleague recently about this, and I remember this colleague posed that challenge. Well, you say about resilience, but yet it sounds like still about the individual and not the processes. And I, and
I,
I, and
yeah.
I said, and I said that, well, yes, look, it's true, but you can't extricate the individual from the processes.
Yeah.
And
And I,
actually, as far, in the context of where we are, unfortunately, one of the other discoveries, I think, from the emotional labor context, so not as resilience, but the other context, was that we really live in nursing in a culture of silence.
yeah. Oh, yes, absolutely.
And that silence it is us as a group that we perpetuate, unfortunately.
And I would add to that, Cynthia, sorry to interrupt you
No, not at
there.
all, please.
I think the shame and the work that Brene Brown has done around vulnerability and shame.
Absolutely.
You know, this is when I call it you getting up on the balcony and you're looking at a situation from different perspectives, and you, particularly if you kind of read around outside of health, and that's something I always encourage nurses to do. That for me, when I read Brene Brown's book and she talks about that vulnerability and shame, and
Yes.
it was like, there is so much in this that links to what you've demonstrated so well here, Cynthia, you know. And I think the other thing I really want to say is, likewise, I I used to call myself a resilience coach when I first started my coaching, and I had to change the word because
Mm.
people just, it was like an allergy to that
Yeah.
word. And you
People
could
are, yeah.
see the shutters come
Yeah.
down, and people would be like, oh God, that word again. If I hear that word one more time, I mean, all that, you know, it was a big learning curve for me because I understood that word to mean much more.
Oh,
But what I
goodness.
was forgetting was actually, you know, people were fed up of being told you have to be resilient. And it was like a sticking plaster. You and I know there's more to that word. But,
Yeah.
you know, I just, listening to what you've articulated there, there's so many aspects, so many important aspects, Cynthia, that, you know, your work brings to the fore. Really, it shines a light on these really challenging issues that nurses face and other healthcare professionals. I think, you know, we look at paramedics and we look at junior doctors, there's
Absolutely.
very similar themes run throughout. But as you eloquently said before, you know, healthcare has become more of a business model, and these things get lost. And I think we probably need a part two podcast, I think.
Oh, well,
But
I would love to be able to sort of look at, and I don't know if that it'll be me, but in terms of
well,
what processes actually in the vet, and what
yeah,
maybe how we can influence and what we need to be recommending, because
yeah,
there's a lot of recommendations out there already
there
for
are, and
process to change.
it's almost like we need a whole think tank of people to really say, okay, you know, there's a lot of research now, there's a lot of um, implications for how we train, how we support, and what is it that we need to change foundationally, I think, from a teaching perspective, but also from an ongoing support and conversations and bringing it up to the surface, because there's still a lot of this that's pushed down because people feel they can't
Absolutely.
speak up or
Yeah.
can't say. And you know, that whole situation, it comes fundamentally back to, and I talk a lot about this, that we're losing really good people in health, in nursing, in medicine, you know, all of the professions, because we're not addressing this. And the whole looking at why do people leave, we don't do exit interviews very well. It's a tick box exercise,
Mm.
more of a quantitative than a qualitative approach. And if we were really wanting to understand and change that and retain some of our fabulous nurses, you know, who are leaving because they can't do it anymore, not because they don't want to, it comes back to the emotional labor and all of, you know, learning the boundaries and all of the important things you brought up here. It's, to me, very short-sighted in a world where we're all competing together
Mm.
for nurses globally. And,
Absolutely.
you know, I think it's time that we talk about these elephants, really, and what can we do?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And just to, I guess, balance the thoughts, so some services are out there trying, and I know they
Yes,
are
they are.
trying.
They are. They are.
What I think is missing is what we're talking about. I think just
Yeah.
to refine a little bit of that point of discussion is the processes behind that. Because
Yeah.
some services do have,
They do.
they provide, I don't know, coaching or clinical supervision
Yeah.
or training for,
Yeah.
or they set out sessions, or they do bits and pieces here and there. What has happened globally, I think, and globally they speak about this, is that whilst that's on offer, there's things like groups of people who won't take up on it for whatever reasons, so won't
Yeah.
take it. So sometimes it's about the same thing as you do, talking
Yeah.
about coaching, talking about growth, talking about
Yeah.
learning,
Yeah.
also glazes people's eyes
Yeah.
sometimes.
It
And you have
does.
to be aware of that
Yeah.
yourself, I think.
Yeah.
And this is no judgment, this is just
No,
an
no.
observation.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then there's also things like processes that hinder, is the fact that whilst those things are very nice and available and could do a lot of good, people just cannot attend
Yeah. Yeah.
because, particularly for nurses, our
Yeah.
world is our patients. Our world
Exactly.
is, and our
Yeah.
focus is primarily them.
Yeah.
And so you're never going to leave that behind, or we're never going to leave the colleagues behind either. So
No.
in some ways, from our, and this is where we have to sort of think about it as a collective rather than
Yeah.
silos,
Individual. Yeah.
because we're fitting into that wheel. I'm not by any means suggesting a riot. I'm by no means suggesting that we leave our patients or
No,
leave
no,
our colleagues in
no,
the lurch.
no.
We need to be mindful of that by continuing to do and actually not speak up and say that
Yeah.
actually we're at the end of our tether, that we're being affected, and in actual fact the people
Yeah.
that we care for and work with are being affected, then it just
Yeah.
continues that way, status
Yeah.
quo. It keeps the
Yeah.
status quo,
Yeah.
and that's the sad truth, I think, about silence, that it just maintains whatever the status quo is.
I
and
know.
and and I don't know that, in terms of big massive leaderships, that people are set out to make everybody's life difficult. I don't think that's it.
No.
However, the world has evolved, the world has changed. What the demands are so much
Mm,
different from what they have been
mm.
in the past. And that has really, really taken away from the humane side of things in terms
Yeah.
of care. That, I think, that's where we sit in with this. And part of, I suppose, I probably want to say that part of my work is such a small little thing in the context of all. But it is an important bit about, looking at
Absolutely.
yourself and the self-care, because you have to be okay, not just because of work.
Yeah.
You got to be okay as a human so
Yeah.
that you are a better person to yourself
Yeah.
as well as
Yeah. Yeah.
others. I guess it's a domino effect almost, and,
Yeah.
and and the influence that you can have
And I
around that
think
space.
also part of this is helping people to see that you can learn to be strategic and learn to use your voice in a way that people listen. I think we're sometimes the silence is people it can be intimidating to say some of these things, but
Yes,
to be able
absolutely.
to help people
Absolutely.
articulate in a way that will people will listen, I think is also an important skill, you know.
Absolutely. And using a different type of language is the
Yeah,
other one. And I,
yeah,
and I think that also came
yeah,
out of the
your
learning in terms
research.
of that project, is about, you know, everybody will listen to a different aspect of things, so they'll have a different way of conversing.
Yeah,
And whilst we may not understand it, you know, I suppose in some ways it's similar to what I said before about the the higher levels of management or higher levels of leadership,
Yes.
they've got a vision about things, and in their world that vision will improve certain things, but then they
Mm,
might be missing the small picture. We
mm.
need to become informed about what that vision might be, or what the intent is, at least, to be
Yes.
able
Yeah.
to sort of say, great intent, however, this is not going to work because of X, Y, and Z.
Mm,
So it's a different way of thinking, a different way of learning. Because sometimes, and we got to be mindful of this,
yeah.
we silo ourselves into our own
Yeah.
minds, into our own thinking,
Yeah.
and also our own little space, without actually realizing that we're
Yeah.
part of a much, much bigger co-will.
Yeah. And also it sounds almost too simple to say this, but a lot of it is also mindset. So
Mm,
that self-belief that you
yes.
can influence and can say,
Yes.
and rather than, you know, some of the messages that we sometimes hear a lot are, well, nobody listens, that's the way it's always been. And we can switch that, we can change that. What if it was different? What if we knew how to be different? What if we knew how to say things differently?
Mm,
That would change so much.
mm, absolutely.
Yeah. Cynthia, it's been such a pleasure to interview you. I could honestly go for another hour with this, and I would love to
Thanks,
have you
Eva.
back to talk some
Thank you,
more.
Eva.
I would, I'd like to be able to share the links to your articles. I know that you've published, I think, quite a few articles, so maybe if you could share those with me and I can
Of
share
course.
them with the listeners. And I would just like to give you the final word, really. I've kind of deviated from my questions, but that's okay because I think you've really articulated some very important messages and conversations that we need to have. So I would just like to ask you, to any nurse who's listening to your podcast interview, what would you like to say to them if they want to start to make changes within to really be able to be in a position to help themselves, to foster a little bit of self-compassion and learn the boundaries? What advice would you give to that person?
No pressure, Eva. Please ask. um, One of my things, I think, for anybody at all in nursing, first of all, is be curious about yourself.
Mm,
The be curious is probably a big exclamation mark. What I mean by being curious about yourself is learn to listen to your instincts.
yeah.
Learn to realize where there's dissonance for you, where it doesn't quite fit. And if you see something that's not quite right, then start thinking about who are those people. Start looking. So be curious again about who might be the key people that you might need to have those conversations about.
Mm,
I would say very closely to curiosity is the develop your relationships. Your relationships are so important. If we develop relationships whereby we can have the floor of voice, and remember when I say those sort of things too, we got to pick our time, mind you,
yeah.
don't wait too long, but there might be, if somebody's
No.
really busily doing
Yes.
something, they're not going to be able to hear
No.
you. So
No.
pick your time or manage that yourself. So
Yeah.
you ask for a time, write down what you want to say, write down what you've observed, but also write down what is the alternate outcome. And if you have ideas, if you've got, get in touch with your creative side of things as well.
Mm,
How might we tackle this?
yeah.
Have conversations with people, with key people, learn.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
number three,
Yeah.
so it's be curious about everything. So anything that you ask, rather than react and
Yes.
scream out,
Yeah.
maybe
Yeah.
ask a question.
Yeah.
It's a different way of communicating. You're still hopefully making an impact by highlighting an issue
Yeah.
without the emotional, I guess,
Yeah.
pressure
Yeah.
or reactivity, if you like. Again, it's about outcomes. What is the outcome that I want? Is me saying no going to have a different outcome? To saying,
Mm,
I'm wondering why you're actually making that decision.
yeah.
But the third one, now I've lost my train of thought. But so it was to be curious, have a relationship, and I don't know, there's so many, my apologies, everyone.
That's all right.
So, but yeah, so I think that there will be my things, because I think what I was going to say was in the context of relationships, just you need to, I guess, be the model.
Yeah.
Even sometimes the expectations for all of us, I think, is that our superiors, our seniors, our colleagues who have been there a little bit longer than that, we often say they should model, they should be, and perhaps, yes, they should be.
Yeah.
Even not, though, then there's opportunity for us to be that.
Yes. Yeah.
And, and hopefully go in a different way and not perpetuate the status quo that we may not want. Of course, we want to perpetuate all the status quos in the world that actually have a good outcome for most people, of course. But if it's something that it's not good for you, then different. Have a think about your values. Where do you see, where do you stand, and pay attention to how you're deploying them every day, because I'm sure that you are.
Yeah.
I think
Thank
that's
you
it, Eva.
so much, Cynthia. It's just, we will have to do part 2.
It's very, very kind.
There's so much we could go, and I'm conscious that you've given so much really for people to listen to and take away. And I'm very, very grateful for you sharing
Thank you. I am grateful to you for having me over and giving me the, the opportunity to sort of have a frank discussion about all these things. And yes, absolutely. I think there's lots that we could do still.
Definitely.
This is just one tiny, tiny little study in the cog of things, but I'm hoping that it might inspire other people as well to start sort of thinking about these things and looking at what we could do.
Thank you. And I will put links in the episode to you and to the articles. Well, all of that information will be in there.
Thank you very, very much, Eva.
You're welcome.
Such a pleasure. Thank you.